Hey guys, it's Eamon. So I'll be taking a look at the most important game of my chess career so far. The game was played in the Colorado Closed Championship, a round robin tournament with some of Colorado's strongest players. Going into this last round game, I led my opponent, National Master Zachary Bekkedahl, by half a point, which means that if I either won or drew the game, then I would win the championship and cross the 2200 rating barrier for the first time. This game is also a great example of evaluating long-term compensation for sacrifice material. So let's take a look at it. The opponent opens with e4, and I play c5. So in a top level event, it would be really unusual to see the Sicilian defense played in a situation where the black player only needs a draw for a favorable result. But I've played the Sicilian my whole career, and I'm pretty familiar with it, so I decided to stick with it. Knight f3, and e6. So this is my favorite line in the Sicilian. It avoids some of the sharpest main lines. And g3. So this is a really unusual move to see in this position. The most common move by far is d4, going in for the open Sicilian. g3 is of course fine. White just wants to fianchetto his bishop and castle as quickly as possible. Now I play d5, striking back in the center, and we get an exchange of pawns, and d4. So now I just want to develop my kingside pieces and castles. So I play knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castles, and castles. Now d takes c5. So white takes the c5 pawn, and I'm forced to lose a tempo with my bishop. I've moved this bishop twice in the opening, but at least my king is safe, and I have pretty good development in this position. Now I'm left with this isolated queen's pawn, and the IQP can be both a blessing and a curse. In this game, it does become pretty weak after knight bd2, knight c6, and c3. So my opponent wants to blockade this pawn and establish good control of d4. That's the first step in playing against an isolated queen's pawn. I played bishop g4 and h3. So h3 is a good move because it forces my bishop to choose between diagonals. Here on g4, it's doing two important functions. It's pinning the knight, but it could also retreat back along this diagonal if need calls for it. So h3 forces me to choose between those two diagonals, and I actually choose incorrectly here. I went bishop h5, which is a slight inaccuracy. And the point is that now this bishop cannot defend this weak d5 pawn. So the pawn is much weaker now. Now knight b3, I go bishop b6, and bishop g5. So white immediately hits on the weakness of this d5 pawn. And at this point, I'm basically guaranteed to lose this pawn because I'm not going to be able to defend it enough times. So I decided I need to play for activity in this position. So I went rook e8, activating my rook along the e-file. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and queen takes d5. So I've lost the pawn, but now I go bishop g6. And I have some compensation for the lost pawn in the form of the bishop pair. These bishops look really nice along these diagonals, sniping across the board, and they're also really well anchored by these pawns. You can see this bishop is defended twice, and this bishop is defended by the a pawn. So they're really solid on these squares and can't be easily harassed by white. Now knight fd4. So this is a decent move. White sets up a blockade in the middle of the board. And this construction with the knights on b3, d4, and the pawns on c3 and b2 is a really solid construction. It's not going to be easy for black to break through this construction. Specifically, this knight on d4 that's well protected blocks this diagonal and also blocks the d file. So it's going to be hard for black to get activity along those open lines. I go rook d8, trying to gain a tempo on the queen. But my opponent finds the best move here, rook e1, fighting back for control of the e-file. And the tactical point is that I have a weak back rank. So if I tried to exchange rooks and then win the queen, this would lose immediately to rook e8 checkmate. So rook e1 is definitely the best move, fighting back for control of the file. And how should I play here? I'm down a pawn, so I don't want to exchange too many pieces. So I go knight e5. maintaining the tension in the center, but I do lose the second pawn on b7. Now I go rook e7, forcing the queen to a6, which is a pretty poor square for the queen. And how do we evaluate this position? So white is up 2 pawns, but black does have some trumps in the position. I have these two strong bishop pair, like we already talked about, and my rooks are well placed in the middle of the board. I'm pretty quickly going to play this rook to e8, gaining control of the e-file. And my knight is also well placed here on e5. It can jump into either of these squares. And it can't be easily kicked away from the center with f4 because that would seriously weaken this diagonal. So because black's pieces are so active and they can't be easily harassed by the white pieces, we can say that black definitely has compensation for the two sacrifice pawns. Now I go h5. h5 does two important things. It gives my king some luft so that I no longer have back rank problems. And it also introduces this idea of playing h4, weakening the dark squares around white's king. Since white has already played h3, these two pawns on dark squares are really important defenders of his king. And if I can eliminate those pawns, then the king is going to become much weaker. Now queen e2 was played, bringing the queen back into the center of the board, which is definitely a decent move. However, the best move was rook e3, and this does a couple things. Mainly, it just protects the third rank here, specifically this d3 square that black was threatening to use. And it also creates some space for the queen to come back and hide behind, either on e2 or potentially coming back to f1 and then bringing the other rook over to e1. So the computer says that white has a slight advantage here, but it's really not convincing for human eyes. The game can continue h4, and then after g4, trying to keep things closed. Black can play rook e8, fighting for control of the e-file. And just to illustrate some of the traps in this position, white could, a natural looking move would be rook a e1. This would actually lose immediately to knight d3. And here with the weakness of f2 and the rook being hit, as well as these two strong rooks on the e-file, uh, white is actually lost here. So after h5, queen e2 was played. And the queen does look kind of awkward on the e-file, so I play rook de8, ganging up on the queen on the e-file. And the queen has to step to d2 now. The queen has to step out of the way of these rooks. If, for example, h4 was played, then knight f3 is already a winning move, and these rooks are too strong on the file. For example, after queen takes, we'd win the exchange with the rook takes e1. So that's why queen d2 was played, stepping off the e-file. And I go knight c4, hitting the queen and opening up the rooks on the e-file. Now rook takes e7 is forced. You can see this move is forced because the queen doesn't have any good squares where it can continue to defend this e1 rook. So rook takes e7. And I don't want to take the queen immediately because here white would get far too many pieces for the queen. In this line, uh, now white would be up a piece. So I play queen takes e7. Rook takes e7 does look pretty natural, but I was worried about queen f4 here. And this would force the queens off the board, and white would be not totally out of the woods, but at least he's relieved a lot of the pressure. So that's what I take with the queen here. Queen f4 anyways. And now I pick up this pawn on b2. And this is a really important pawn to win because it wins the base of this structure on the queen side. You can see previously white had this really strong structure, really solid on the queen side, and now winning the base, now this c3 pawn becomes a target. And once I can win c3, then both of these knights in the center become significantly weakened. Now bishop d5 is played, and I really don't like this move for the simple fact that the bishop is undefended on d5. And the classic mantra, loose pieces drop off, is especially relevant in this position. At the moment, the bishop can't be attacked, but we're going to see later in the game, this bishop being loose becomes very relevant. The bishop does look active in the center of the board here, and we can see this bishop is now hanging because of this pin. This bishop on g6 is now loose, but there's no good way for white to attack this bishop or generate threats. Now I play knight d3, hitting the queen, and the knight is now what we call an octopus knight here. It's a really, really pretty piece here on d3. It hits a lot of key squares, and it can't be easily challenged. Because of this strong octopus knight, it was better for white to play bishop f1 in this position, trying to control this knight stack, the squares for this knight. But white played bishop d5 instead, and after knight d3, the queen drops back to d2. And now I finally play this h4 move, trying to undermine white's kingside pawns here. Now the pressure is really ramping up. And now my opponent made the critical blunder in the game, king h2, which is a losing move, but it requires some tactical points to try to prove it. So if you want, go ahead and pause the video in this position and try to find best move for black to play and win. So the move is knight takes f2, shattering white's pawn structure on the king side here. And the tactical point is that after queen takes f2, I would play h takes g3, and now whichever way white takes, he's going to lose material. If queen takes g3, then bishop c7 wins the queen. And if king takes g3, then I have queen g5 check, forking the king and the loose bishop on d5. And now we can see why the bishop is so poorly placed here on d5, where it's undefended. So after knight takes f2, my opponent didn't take the knight. He saw those variations and played rook g1, trying to hold together the king side. But the problem is the white king is now far too weak. And I expose it further by taking on g3, rook takes g3, and knight e4. Forking queen and rook, so the knight has to be taken. White played bishop takes e4, and queen takes e4. So in this position, material is now technically equal, but the the couple factors mean that black is totally winning in this position. First of all, king safety. If we compare the two kings, black's king is totally safe behind this bishop and these two pawns, whereas white does have one pawn in front of it and the rook, but he's far too weak along these diagonals. With these bishops sitting like snipers along these diagonals, there's going to be no defense for the white king. Now knight b5. So knight b5 tries to control c7 so that bishop c7 doesn't immediately win the exchange here. And it also could threaten knight d6 in some variations. And now all that's left for black to do is to try to expose the king in the quickest way possible. So I play queen b1, taking control of this back rank. And really the only idea behind this move is to play rook e1 and establish control of the back rank. Importantly, white can't challenge the back rank with a move like rook g1 because of this bishop sitting on this diagonal. Now c4 was played, and c4 has the idea of trying to play c5 and to block out this bishop, but it's simply too slow. After rook e1, now I'm threatening, now if, for example, c5, now I'm threatening mate in 2 with rook h1 and queen f1 check, so that's not playable. So after rook e1, white goes rook g2 to try to give his king an escape square here on g3. So I play rook h1 check anyways, king g3, and lots of ways for black to play here, but by far the cleanest is to play queen f5, bringing the queen back to the center and threatening this h3 pawn, among other things. Now rook h2 is played to try to cover this h3 pawn, but now black can win material by force with queen e5 check, skewering the king and the rook. If the king moves, then we'll just pick up the rook on the next move. And after queen f4, I played rook g1 check, and this was the final move of the game. White is going to lose the queen. After, for example, king f3, rook f1 check is going to pick up the queen, and the game is over. All right, so thank you guys so much for watching that game. I think it was a pretty instructive example of sacrificing two pawns to play for long-term compensation. And you can see these two bishops didn't move the entire game, but they had such an impact on the game. They're really important pieces, but since they were so well anchored on these squares, they didn't have to move the entire game. So I think that's a pretty instructive point in this game. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and also check out my link for private coaching in the description if you're interested in private lessons. Thanks. See you in the next one.